Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your daily sit rep for Monday, the 29th of December, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. We have a lot to catch up on. Happy Monday morning to everyone. Jared, let's start with this. We were just talking about this before the show. So apparently last week, this may have been on Wednesday, presumably the U.S. military struck a target in Venezuela. And this is something that President Trump mentioned on a radio show on Friday. Oh shoot, I don't have it anymore. But he said there's some facility down there, apparently a shipping facility where these Venezuelan oil tankers were coming out of, and at least according to President Trump, we struck them. He didn't provide any further details, but apparently New York Times is picking up on this as well, Jared.
Yes, the New York Times, they had the radio interview, and Trump had said, hey, yes, we did strike a facility. The New York Times also citing anonymous sources claiming that it's definitely in Venezuela. And there's an area that we're going to cover a bit later in the show, unless you want to get into it right now, where I think this can be done legally and not have a question of sovereignty for Venezuela.
Okay. Well, that's a bold claim. Let's definitely cover it in the global sit rep. Thanks for that update. And we'll continue to look into that. Although the poly market, I've been paying a lot closer attention to poly market, just looking at these betting markets and looking at, I'm going to take a swing on one. We'll talk about it a little bit later on here. But apparently that military engagement, only 13% of bettors said that, or however it works, 13% said the U.S. would not militarily engage Venezuela before December 31st. And apparently, according to President Trump and the New York Times, now we have. So congratulations on whoever took that bet by the 31st. All right. With that, let's go ahead and move on. Robert, good morning. Let's jump inside the Beltway. There's been over the weekend, there's a lot of coverage about these new strategies that Republicans and Democrats are taking heading into the midterms. Let's start with the Republicans.
Good morning, Mike. So President Trump's 2024 campaign strategist, James Blair, is running the Trump administration's 2026 midterm election strategy. This is important because Blair is the figure who came up with the idea of targeting low and mid propensity voters in the 2024 election. And according to White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, he will be running the 2026 strategy using the same strategy, targeting low propensity voters, which I think is important because the midterm is a turnout game, and this is not a guarantee of Republicans keeping the House. But I think this is helping create the conditions for it, combined with some of the other issues that the Democratic Party is facing heading into the midterms.
Mm-hmm. Robert, I just read in Politico this morning, it was an update on the Democrat strategy. Apparently there's an 8-figure spending budget for targeting rural voters. And they're talking about Abigail Spanberger, who won the Virginia governor's race. She expanded her lead in rural communities, like 49 of 50-something rural communities in Texas. She outperformed Kamala Harris. And they talked to former now Senator Joe Manchin, also a kind of a centrist Democrat, saying if Democrats just remain centrist, they will beat Trump. I mean, effectively, that's basically what he said. He said Democrats have to be a lot more moderate, and they'll win. Maybe that's the case. At any rate, what do you make of this? Democrats targeting rural voters heading into the midterms. It seems like that's a high risk, but potentially high payoff if they can eat into some of the rural gains that Trump made in 2024. Maybe some of these Democrats do better. How do you see that?
It is a high risk strategy. The rural voters typically are not part of the Democratic base. Their bases over the last roughly 20 to 30 years has shifted largely to urban, educated, and suburban voters. I think what their real goal is likely to depress turnout in some of the rural areas, rather than trying to necessarily convert Trump voters over to the Democratic Party. And a lot of basically depressed turnout means having some kind of political messaging that causes people who would vote for the Republicans in the midterm to not show up while driving their own turnout. They tried something similar, or they talked about doing something similar after the 2024 election. I think it was Third Way is that centrist think tank, Democrat think tank. And they've been proposing this for a while now. I think we covered it in January, like going out to church events and tailgating and having barbecues and trying to get rural voters to start turning out for Democrats. So I think the centrist faction of the party does actually think that will be effective. I think whether it will actually work and whether that becomes a long-term Democrat thing will depend on how well centrist versus the Democratic Socialist and Progressive candidates perform, because that fight is still ongoing between the different factions over the future control of the Democratic Party.
The AOC wing versus the more moderate wing. By the way, I saw Susie Weil say that President Trump was going to start stumping in these midterm election races, apparently going on some nationwide speaking and rally tour, which Republicans have seen. When Trump is on the ballot, he does well. When he's not on the ballot, Republicans do very poorly. All right. With that, we'll move on, Robert. Let's move on to some of these ICE and activist updates. Go ahead.
Yeah, so there's this activist group called Win Without War, and they said they're going to continue an outreach campaign nationwide targeting military personnel over the quote illegal orders issued by the Trump administration. And they've already been putting up these billboards outside of military bases starting late summer. Now they're talking about putting one outside of MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, which is the home of CENTCOM and Special Operations Command. In an email over the weekend to their supporters, they said that this nationwide billboard campaign so far has resulted in multiple staff officers and at least one drone pilot that has reached out to the organization, quote, out of fear of legal consequences for their role in what they called Trump and Hegseth illegal boat strikes. And then according to U.S. government data, ICE made a record number of 17,500 what they're calling at-large arrests of illegal immigrants in September. This means specifically arrests that are not part of detainers, where ICE sends these detainers to local and state jails. And according to data that's released so far for October, it looks like this is set to increase this number of at-large arrests. And this is largely a change that happened after ICE shifted from detaining from these detainers to conducting these operations, these immigration operations across the U.S., not just in the larger declared federal surges, but they've also been conducting sweep operations in cities without announcing new federal surge operations. And then finally, a California federal district judge blocked ICE from making any immigration arrests outside of the federal immigration courts in San Francisco, California. This is kind of unusual for a federal judge to block it outside of federal courts. So far, most of what I could find for precedent has been state courts and states blocking these immigration arrests outside of courthouses. So this is only a temporary block, and I'm still keeping an eye on where this goes as far as whether the appellate courts side with the Trump administration on this or not.
Robert, speaking of these judges, we saw where earlier this year there was a Somali who was convicted of fraud in like a multi-million-dollar fraud case. A jury of quote unquote his peers found him guilty of fraud, and you have this judge in Minnesota throw the conviction out for whatever her reason was over the weekend. And one reason why we didn't cover it in this morning's report, just because it's been all over social media, but you have this guy Nick, whatever his name is, and he goes out to these daycare centers in Minneapolis or in the greater Minneapolis area, and some of these daycares are getting millions of dollars in these federal grants. And he goes, there's like, where are the kids? And it's like a warehouse. I didn't watch the whole video, but it seems to be like there's a warehouse, there's a business there that just has a daycare sign on the front, and there are no kids there. And now there's many accusations about this being a massive fraud operation, not just in Minnesota, but people are looking into in Ohio and Washington State. A lot of these what appear to be Somali run daycares, which may not actually be daycares, and they may just be getting federal funds. So potentially billions of dollars in fraud here. You saw that, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So far, we've seen Vice President J.D. Vance issue a strongly worded tweet. Apparently, Kash Patel is on the case over at FBI, allegedly looking into it. Just want to, Robert, do you have anything on that point. It's still early, and right now these are just allegations, but there's a lot of smoke. Certainly seems like fire.
Yeah, so the FBI investigation apparently started under the Biden administration, though the appearance is that it was basically doing the minimum so that the Biden administration couldn't be accused of ignoring it. But from what the DOJ has put out since the investigation, they say started in 2021, but some of those convictions come from really late in the Biden administration. There's been some other moves from the Trump administration, like the Department of Labor. I think we reported last week is also investigating some other potential avenues of fraud, including unemployment insurance fraud. As far as the judges, that judge vacating that conviction, I've seen allegations. Some of these other judges have also been not necessarily vacating convictions, but just dismissing cases. And I think it was reported in the beginning of the year that there was a huge scandal in one of these cases because there was very blatant jury tampering, and some of the people who were convicted in one of these fraud cases was also caught attempting to bribe jurors. So I imagine there's going to be a lot more of this bribery situation going on in the courts. I think that the Trump administration is going to find, and part of that is outside of the United States and a lot of places like Somalia, the way that people interact with the government is usually through bribes. So when they come here and they get convicted, I imagine a lot of them assume that they're going to be able to get out of it by doing the same thing they would do back home.
Mm-hmm. Last point on this, just kind of at a longer term strategic level. We've heard a lot about Gen Z, how based the young people are. And I think for white kids in Generation Z, that is true. I think polls do show consistently they are the most conservative generation in generations, at least among the white youths. I also saw a poll over the weekend that the highest level of church attendance now for all generations in the United States is now Gen Z. They have the highest church attendance rates. And it seems to me that you look at what happened between 2020 and then all during the Biden administration, and now with this Somali fraud thing and the courts blocking the Trump administration from trying to deport even what maybe 600,000 people that I think DHS said officially they've deported. And the Trump administration has a fight in the courts tooth and nail just to deport 600,000. It sure seems to me like there's going to be a massive backlash. And this is something that I've been talking about for several years. And someone in the chat also said this. Cordite says, seems like the moderates have a shelf life dependent mostly on boomers. They'll probably shift hard towards progressivism. I guess he's talking about the Democrat Party once the boomers start dying off. And yes, boomers have been a moderating force on American politics. What is it in the next, I think by 2030, 100% of boomers will be age 65 and older, meaning in the next 10 to 20 years, boomers' power and influence within American politics is going to dry up and be in terminal decline. And I do think what we are going to be left with now in Gen X and millennials, that's kind of a different thing. But at least among Gen Z, it does seem like they will split. They will break very hard towards the populist left and the populist right. And U.S. politics, I think, is going to radically change over the next 20 years. All right. Robert, do you see that as well?
Yeah, and I think part of this is that the boomer generation, they lived through the aftermath of World War II, so there's a lot of economic prosperity, which is a moderating force. If you have, if people are relatively economically successful, they are not attracted to radical politics on as wide a scale. Obviously, there were radical political movements during the 60s and 70s and 80s, but I think we have the potential to see, as boomers age out, basically of being involved in politics, that we are going to see potentially another one of these cycles that America has gone through, where there is an increase in radical politics and political violence as well. Mm-hmm. Speaking of the 60s and 70s, and then prior to World War II, we also had a similar cycle with anarchists and communists in the United States. I think as younger people become a greater proportion of the American public that is involved in politics, and they're becoming more radical. Whether you're talking conservative or liberal, left or right, we are going to see, I think, a return to a much more radical style of politics that
Right.
happened to exist in the United States in the past.
Certainly. We are within easily within 5 to 10 years of that. And actually, I guess you could probably say it started in 2016 with the breakdown of elite consensus. Thanks for that, Robert. And Jared, we'll flip it over to you for the global sit rep, starting with the latest out of Venezuela.
Yes. So the Venezuelans, particularly their vice president, announced a new food distribution program. And this, they say, is to combat the United States blockade, which is actually on sanctioned oil. Now, the vice president claims this to serve 5 million people, but that's not enough, according to the World Food Program. They claim there are about 12 million Venezuelans that are experiencing moderate to severe food insecurity, and Venezuela is a net food importer. So I do think this shows a severe vulnerability for the Venezuelans, the Venezuelan regime, because the main opposition, the United States, is a food exporter that could be exploited very easily. Then moving kind of next door, Insight Crime, this is a think tank focused on crime in Latin America, released a report earlier this month claiming that the National Liberation Army, referred to as the ELN, is receiving support from the Venezuelan government. Now, the ELN is one of the major cartels operating in Colombia. Insight Crime reports that ELN's drug operations actually moved out of Colombia and into Venezuelan border states, where the ELN pays the Cartel of the Suns, Cartel de los Soles, which we've covered extensively. That is actually the network of Venezuelan generals that get paid through there. Additionally, the ELN controls actually governing several of these border states, and they are allowed to do that because they are pro-Maduro, because he allows them to operate. Now, this, I think, is where we start getting into maybe strikes will not question Venezuela's sovereignty. The reason for that is this would have to be run by a lawyer, but these are cartels. They're I don't remember if ELN is designated a terrorist organization, but Cartel de los Soles is. They are running an illicit operation, or running illicit states along the border. In the Red Sea, where the Houthis control Yemen, strikes happen fairly frequently. It may be legal internationally to conduct a strike on an illicit state like this. Like I said, this would have to be run by a lawyer, but I think this could potentially stand up amongst international law and pretty much allow the U.S. to do what it needs to do inside of those states.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the ELN is a designated foreign terrorist organization, according to the State Department.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, listen, if it's true, President Trump said it was, but if it's true that we did launch military strikes against Venezuela last week against what is it really, a civilian target? Apparently, it was some sort of facility, correct?
Yeah,
like a shipping yard or something like that, where these boats were coming in and out of.
Yes, and ELN does operate facilities in the port here in these border states as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this could be the first of several, potentially many, U.S. military strikes.
I think
ELN operating inside Venezuela. Okay,
I think so. I think this radically increases the likelihood of strikes if they're able. If a lawyer can say, yes, there's no state protecting these states anymore. Like Venezuela is not covering these states anymore, not officially. That opens up strikes. And there's been a lot of talk about invasion. I've said, no, never going to happen. I still do not think it is likely, but the material requirement would be significantly lower for this area than the entirety of Venezuela. So that
I don't even think you need. Yeah, you wouldn't even need boots. I mean, there would be potentially some forward deployment of U.S. boots on ground, but certainly no large scale conventional footprint. You'd be doing like unconventional warfare kind of stuff. But really, this seems to be most likely some form of decapitation strike, or encouraging the generals to revolt and have some kind of quasi-democracy take over. Jared, you already reported a week or two ago, Venezuela already has a government in waiting, basically just waiting to take over once Maduro goes. That may be peaceful. Polymarket said there's something like a 7% chance Maduro survives U.S. military strikes. Whether you call this thing that happened apparently last Wednesday a military strike or not, it was at least against a civilian target. So not military on military, at least not yet. All right, thanks for that, Jared. And let's move on here to the big news breaking overnight, which is China launched this new exercise, and they are again simulating this blockade of Taiwan.
Yes, this is one of their largest exercises ever. They're calling it Justice Mission 2025, and it's the entire joint force, their Army, Navy, Rocket Force, Air Force, even their Coast Guard's getting involved. They're practicing blockade maneuvers. They claim they are going to gain complete control over the surrounding area and establish deterrence, presumably from the United States and Japan intervening. The state media, Global Times, also reported that China's even simulating decapitation strikes on Taiwan. So striking Taipei to eliminate the government there. And like I mentioned, the Coast Guard is actually running a concurrent drill to practice the law enforcement aspect of this.
And then just China has done this squeeze and release kind of system before, where they squeeze Taiwan with these military exercises, basically trying to build up a baseline of military activity and presence in the region, so that when they are ready to launch this eventual, probably a blockade of Taiwan, they've gone through so many of these squeezes that it looks like just another military exercise, and then it's the real thing. Are we still expecting 2027 to be the date? Like, this is probably not going to happen prior to. And I asked that because over the weekend, I saw a lot of Chinese accounts on social media talking about these container ships and how they have thousands of these container ships and they can hold these modular missile systems. And we've been talking about these ROROs, the roll-on, roll-offs that are being retrofitted so that rather to facilitate this invasion or at least some amphibious assault against Taiwan. Are we still looking at 2027 or could this happen sooner?
I maintain what I've said before, where 2027 is the likely deadline. I don't think they're ready to meet it. Keep in mind, this is probably the first time they've run a real drill on this. They've done plenty of exercises, but it's not been totally coordinated. It hasn't been to this scale, and they haven't done offensive maneuvers in conjunction with it. I still don't think they're going to make the 2027 deadline, but I also think that goalpost is moving for them. What they have to contend with is not just Taiwan, it is the entire region stepping up against them. Japan has said, we will get involved. Philippines expects to get involved. Actually, the southern box here on the map covers a Philippine territory. Mm-hmm. There is an island there with Marines stationed there from both Philippines and us. That goalpost is moving. Their readiness goalpost is not going to be stationary. So I think it does increase likelihood that they are going to go early because it's only getting worse for them. Mm-hmm. So this may be a dry run in order to just go, okay, we've practiced it, take a couple months, go. I don't think that's likely, but I refuse to take that off the table because their situation is worsening.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. And then briefly, Jared, what are the odds that Operation Justice Mission 2025 is just a head fake and not how they're planning to actually take Taiwan? Jared, it seems pretty low. It seems like this is a rehearsal. This is not just a standard military exercise. This is a rehearsal for the blockade of Taiwan, correct? Yeah,
their options are militarily taking Taiwan or having Taiwan acquiesce, and not a single poll out of Taiwan has said, yeah, we are looking toward this. It doesn't even look like the KMT, the Chinese Nationalist Party in Taiwan, is regaining power anytime soon. It looks like diplomacy is off the table for China, leaving only this option.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then just briefly, please cover South Korea.
Yep. So this is coming from South Korea's defense minister. He said, hey, yeah, security stability on the peninsula is rapidly decreasing because North Korea is preparing to launch a nuclear-powered submarine and is cooperating with Russia. This is messaging meant to garner American support for greater South Korean autonomy, potentially even nuclear weapons. We've covered that Korea's been flirting with that idea for the past couple months now. I think that's a longer-term goal of theirs, though.
All right. Thanks for that global sit rep, Jared. We'll move on here to a brief note. Over the past couple of years, there's been a lot of talk about recession. Were we in an undeclared recession? The National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, is the government entity that officially declares a recession. technically, the United States could be in an economic recession without the NBER officially declaring it. And a lot of people had stated that case because certainly parts of the U.S. economy have been in recession at various points over the past couple of years. At any rate, I read these monthly global fund manager surveys that come out from Bank of America. The latest one has been the most bullish in years, certainly. Just 3% of fund managers see a recession in the next 12 months. About 57% of them see a soft landing, which means low growth, but we narrowly avoid a recession. 37% say no landing, and you add that up, and all that adds up to about 94%. So presumably the remaining 3% did not answer this question. But this global fund manager survey is the most bullish since at least 2021. We see one thing I covered in Friday's economic early warning report. By the way, that's another great reason to join our early warning membership, because you get that report every Friday. I talk about what hedge funds and major investment banks are telling their clients. At any rate, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and all the other big banks are saying that they see economic reacceleration next year. They're saying higher GDP next year. A lot of these bank forecasts, obviously all of them are not infallible, but economic growth is the consensus. Now, unfortunately, if you're President Trump or Republicans, these economic gains are being driven by AI investment, and there's not a lot of organic, healthy, sustainable growth. And that really compounds the K-shaped economic problem that the administration and Republicans are facing. Wall Street is doing very well. They're very optimistic. These bank outlooks for U.S. equities in 26 were also up. And Main Street is struggling. If you ask the average consumer out there what the Q3 GDP was, they have no idea. They do not feel the effects of Q3 GDP. By the way, both the annual third quarter GDP and consumer spending both came in above expectations at an annualized rate of 4.3% and 3.5% respectively. Above consensus, very good economic numbers. But again, most of those economic numbers are going to the top of the K, not the bottom of the K. They're going to the Wall Street part of the K, not the Main Street part of the K. And frankly, you tell the average voter that the annualized rate of economic growth in Q3 was 4.3%. They have no idea what you're talking about, and they also just do not feel the effects. So I can't say that this is a major win for the Trump administration or for Republicans. At any rate, a lot of the current political reporting that I'm reading on Politico and some of these other politically inclined media outlets and news outlets are focusing on how poorly or how vulnerable the Republican House is heading into midterm elections. And one of the big reasons why they say this is because of economic conditions. Polymarket odds on Democrats retaking the House is currently at 79%, which is I think the highest. If it's not the highest, it's right near the highest that it has been since I think they launched it back in July. Historically, over the past couple of decades, 90% of midterm elections lead to a loss of the House for the incumbent party. So 90% of the time, the incumbent party loses control of the House. That's very, very good odds for Democrats, just historically. But it's not to say that Republicans hanging on is impossible. The congressional GOP rating is just 29%. So just 29% of Americans approve of congressional Republicans. Compare that to 24% of Democrats, and of course 17% overall. As Robert mentioned, midterm elections always have much lower turnout. If Trump is going to go out and stump for these candidates, especially vulnerable Republicans, and try to energize that base that led him to victory in 2016, let's just be honest, led him to victory in 2020, and then again in 2024, a spanking in 2016 and 24, then frankly, I look at the 79% odds on Polymarket, and I'm going to take the under. We're going to put some Forward Observer money on the under of at least 79, which is not to say that I don't think Democrats will still win, but 79 seems very high. And if these banks are right, that the United States starts posting more positive economic numbers, I think that 79% is going to come down. So maybe there's a little arbitrage play there. So all this is to say, I don't think anyone should get blackpilled on Republicans losing the House. Historically, yes, they will. And this is going to be a very long 2 years, from January 2027 into November 28 and January 29. Going to be a very long 2 years with impeachment proceedings and investigations. And it's going to be like the Russia kind of stuff all over again. Very contentious time. But I say all this to say that if the economy does post better numbers and President Trump gets back out on the campaign trail, I think actually the GOP could hang on to a slim majority. With that, let's go ahead and move on to these skeptical jurors. So, Robert, jury nullification has come up now a couple of times where an activist has been indicted on charges of assault, and a jury of their peers have nullified the charges and basically said, no, we don't really think this guy broke the law, and that's it. Case closed. Have a nice day. What is this activist training of quote unquote skeptical jurors that's going on in DC right now?
Well, this is coming from a group called Free DC, and they are apparently this month holding training events in Washington, D.C. to train some activists to be, quote, skeptical jurors. They did hint earlier this year during the summer, I think we covered it, they called it the Juror Information Project in June, where they kind of hinted that they've been doing this jury nullification training. I expect that we'll see other activist groups adopt this type of training on jury nullification if they haven't already, because we have seen the Trump administration has lost cases or grand juries have refused to return indictments on cases of assault against federal agents during these federal surges in California and Chicago. And I expect that they will, if this is seen as successful, that this will then spread to some of these other activist groups, because Free DC has gone the other way. They have adopted some of these activist tactics that have been used to disrupt federal surges in other major cities, because they're not just conducting this, they're also doing what they call direct action, which I think they mean direct action demonstrations. And they've also been doing some of the same type of training to monitor ICE operations, all federal agents in DC. But one thing did stand out to me about this interview with one of the founders. She said that their goal is to recruit 24,500 members in Washington, D.C. And she based this off of Erica Chenoweth's Why Civil Resistance Works. The proposal in that book is that a nonviolent resistance movement only needs to mobilize 3.5% of whatever given population, which for Washington, D.C. is 24,500. They did not say, though, how close they are to meeting that recruiting goal.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, listen, this should be required reading. Why Civil Resistance Works. Erica Chenoweth and her research team kind of breaks down aspects of a color revolution. It's very, very important. I'm going to do a book summary as well. We'll probably do a webinar. I'll give you the Mike's notes from that book. At any rate, Robert, if a judge or if some of these courts would agree, could the DOJ try to move some of these assault cases out of, say, a DC into a more favorable court? I mean, I know court cases could potentially be moved.
From what I understand, usually that's only something that can be done by a defendant, somebody who's being accused of this, over the inability to get a fair jury. One of the avenues, though, so jury nullification, a lot of people, I've had this argument with people, they'll say, well, jury nullification is a right. That's not necessarily true. In the past, there have been activist groups who have been charged with jury tampering for promoting jury nullification, especially around courthouses. So I'd have to read up more on the case law for it, but I mean, there's a potential here that this group could run into some trouble from the DOJ especially if they start promoting this stuff like the Jury Information Campaign or Jury Information Project around the courthouses themselves, because that is, I think in the past has been considered jury tampering.
Mm-hmm. Well, my next question is, let's say that a Democrat wins the presidency in 2028 and we see an open border again with Project 2029. Democrats plan to radically reshape the federal government. And let's say that some border vigilante groups are active along the border trying to impede limitless mass immigration coming over the border. And some of them are arrested and they are charged by the Department of Justice. And some of these local communities here in Texas start something similar, some sort of training for jurors, or try to promote this idea of jury nullification to let these guys who are really trying to protect the country. And I mean, could the shoe potentially be on the other foot? It seems to me like whoever the Democrat president would, the DOJ is just going to go after these similar jury nullification efforts under jury tampering. 100% that would happen. But I mean, feasibly, could that happen?
Yeah, and well, I think the way to avoid that in that scenario is to not do any of this activism around the courthouse itself. But yeah, that could be a tool used. Essentially, it's effectively a weapon that a political weapon that anybody could pick up, and I don't see why it wouldn't be effective under a Democratic administration in that scenario.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. And we'll move on. Here, we got a couple items here on gerrymandering, and what's the latest? So previously, Utah was going to pick up a Democrat seat, and now that's gone. Correct?
Well, it's not gone yet. The judge in that case who basically picked the map for Utah for 2026 that added a Democratic district, that is now she said that they can appeal that now. So now it's being appealed to the Utah State Supreme Court, and it's not clear yet how the state Supreme Court is going to rule. But there is another effort by Utah Republicans to overturn what's called Proposition 4, which is the law that effectively allowed that decision, because that requires an independent redistricting commission. And there's a lot of money pouring in for that effort. There's a 501c4, what's called colloquially a dark money group. It's called Securing American Greatness, that just sent $4 million to the Utah GOP for this effort. They're gathering signatures right now for a referendum to overturn this law in the upcoming midterm. And there's also a lot of organization going into. So TPUSA announced that they're going to also be organizing the signature gathering campaign for this effort. And it looks like this is set to be a long-term fight over gerrymandering in Utah, because Utah's also set to gain a seat after the 2030 census to gain an apportionment. So this is going to, I think, make Utah much more important in the fight for keeping or gaining a majority in the House.
Mm-hmm. All right. So as it stands, heading into midterms next year, what's the plus or minus for Democrats and Republicans in these gerrymandering cases, or in these states as it stands right now?
California's +5. Texas is +5 for Republicans. So I think the Republicans are slightly ahead by about 4 seats, or three seats, because it's 5 Texas, potentially 1 in Ohio, and then there's 1 in Missouri. So right now, I think Republicans have a 2 or 3 seat lead. And then after this Supreme Court decision, when they decide to actually release the ruling on the Voting Rights Act, that's potentially going to ramp up Republicans significantly. So +5 and another +5 in Florida, and then I think another 10 to 15 seats in other states that are going to have the potential to get rid of these majority districts and turn those into Republican seats.
Okay. Yeah, I don't want to go too far into this because we've been talking about for a while, and right now it's just speculation. But is the Supreme Court going to make this decision applicable to the 26 midterms, or are they going to say, this is our ruling, minority majority districts out the window, and the states have until 2028 to redraw these district boundaries?
I think it just depends on the timing of the ruling, because if it's this is the Purcell principle. Basically, the Supreme Court has decided that if a court is ruling on an election too close to the election, then they should have it apply to not to that one, but the next election, or avoid any rulings altogether. So I think it just depends on the timing. A lot of states, I think, will be able to make that change because their primaries aren't until February, March timeframe.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, looking at the potentially new district boundaries heading into 26 midterms, and then if the Supreme Court strikes down Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act for 2028, we'll say by 2028, and then we have this 2030 census, assuming it's done accurately. Here's this new map. So the ARP, the American Redistricting Project, they are projecting that by the 2030 census, Republicans will pick up 11 new districts, correct? And basically Democrats are losing 11 districts. So this could potentially, we're potentially talking about 10, 15, 20 plus seats that Republicans will pick up in the House, basically take from Democrats due to the gerrymandering cases, due to Section 2 of the VRA, and then the 2030 census. So, Robert, this could be like a potentially decadal or generational advantage for Republicans in the House, correct?
Correct. And this has been, the Democrats have recognized this too. I think it started at the beginning of the year or right after the 2024 election, warnings about the 2030 census and that this could significantly change the balance of power at the federal level.
Mm-hmm. Well, it certainly would. All right. So, yeah, I see some black pilling in the chat. No one black pill. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. And we do have several questions here. So we'll move on. If boomers are the moderating force, well, I think they are, then can we expect the next 10 to 20 years to be consolidation of powers? No, I don't think power is going to consolidate yet. Here's what my overall expectation. I do think that we are on track for a worsening, obviously political, but definitely a worsening domestic conflict. And I'm not talking about 1861, not World War II, not Russia, Ukraine, not the Civil War, none of that, but low intensity conflict, which has been ongoing for many years now. And low intensity conflict it's war. It's warfare, but it exists beneath the threshold of conventional war. So we're not talking about tanks and bombers, but above routine peaceful competition. So America is not at war with itself, at least not yet, but we're definitely not at peace with ourselves. It's this kind of gray zone between being an outright peace and outright war, low intensity conflict. It includes types of, or sometimes you can refer to as irregular warfare, but on the low end, we're talking about violent social groups and terrorism, obviously political warfare, popular revolutions, color revolutions, all the way up to and including insurgency and counterinsurgency. So insurgency is a form of low intensity conflict, which we potentially could see here in the United States. So what I'm looking at here is what we just talked about, basically the Republicans potentially picking up 10, 15, 20 plus seats, maybe more than that by the 2030 2031, the apportionment phase. So by the, 2032 or whatever election that is. So that presidential election, Republicans, if these three things do end up happening, Republicans will have a structural advantage heading into the 2030s, meaning that they will take more representation away from Democrat states. That obviously is not going to sit well with Democrats. There's this lady named Barbara Walters. She was a CIA analyst, and she was on the Political Instability Task Force, and she wrote this book called How Civil Wars Start. Half of that book is great. The other half is worse than worthless. But the first half that was good. One of her, and the reason why it was worse than worthless is she's extremely partisan in that book. But one of the things that she said is civil wars start when you have politically or culturally dominant parts of society that lose power. They lose that cultural or political dominance, and they don't just sit back and allow themselves to be eroded in most cases. Her argument basically is that they potentially do engage in violence, and that's how civil wars start. And you go back to Peter Turchin. I think Peter Turchin even said that the Republican Party is the revolutionary party in the country. And Neil Howe, the Fourth Turning guy, in his update to the book, The Fourth Turning is here. Correct me if I'm wrong. If I recall correctly, I think he basically says something similar. Like the Republicans would be the revolutionary party. And I could be wrong on that, but it's just, if my memory serves me correctly, which it could be wrong. And that's kind of been this foregone conclusion. That's been this assumption by a great many of these progressive political analysts and pundits, is that male, pale, and stale, crusty old white people are going to lose all their political power, and they're going to start a civil war. And maybe that's true. Maybe that is true. But just consider this: if the Trump administration is successful, remember, no blackpilling here. We cannot be unfairly optimistic either. But looking at Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and then looking at this 2030 census, we could see Republicans, at least in the House, walk away with a structural advantage over Democrats. And that would mean Democrats would be potentially the Revolutionary Party if they are locked out of power for potentially decades because of the structural advantage that Republicans have. Now you take that trend over the next 5 or 10 years, and then you add on 5 or 10 years, boomers losing their power and influence within both parties because they're getting older. And boomers have been this moderating force. So our American political system is going to lose this great moderating force. Now, maybe Gen X steps in and becomes the next moderating force. Maybe it's millennials and Gen X. I don't know. But I do know that with boomers leaving the picture, there's going to be some kind of power vacuum in both parties. I think this power vacuum is the struggle, at least, between the populist left and the establishment left, and the populist right and the establishment right. I think both of those things are obviously happening. In the Democrat Party, you have the Democratic Socialist and the left progressive wing versus the liberal wing, or the moderate, more moderate wing. And then in Republicans, you basically have the MAGA, or America First, or America Only movement versus the neocon establishment, Con Inc., Conservative Incorporated, which we all know very well. And if both of these parties lose these moderating forces, then you could state the case that they are going to go, the Democrat Party is going to go populist left, the Republican Party, or what's left of it, or maybe there's a third party, I don't know, goes populist right. And that is a recipe. This is a total breakdown. One of the things I talked about a couple of weeks ago is the breakdown in the national consensus. And when the national consensus breaks down, you tend to get conflict. We're talking about breakdown in elite consensus, in political consensus, economic consensus. This is breaking down broadly between socialism versus capitalism. Go back to a couple of weeks ago. Members can go back and read that report. It's titled something like "Breakdowns in National Consensus Tend to Lead to Conflict," which is true. So this is another reason. I mean, basically what we're laying out here are some broad trends which could change. These are not foregone conclusions. None of this, I don't think anything is inevitable. But what we're looking at here is a continuation over the next 5, 10, 20 years. Structural trends that are leading to conflict. So I think that's what we're looking at here. And I don't think there will be, to answer your question, Echo, I don't think we will see a consolidation of power. I think we will see some level of state breakdown. And I think we'll probably fight a conflict before a new national consensus is established, because a national consensus, agreement and cooperation on things that we believe in, leads to peace and prosperity. Disagreement over these fundamental things tends to lead to non-cooperation and conflict. And I think that's where we're headed. All right, Jared, about this Taiwan exercise, the Chinese exercise around Taiwan, are rocket forces involved?
Yeah, all branches of the PRC military.
Okay, so this is like a multi-domain combined arms kind of, or at sea, whatever you call combined arms at sea, multi-domain exercise.
Yep.
Okay. Is cyber, is space, I assume electronic warfare is obviously involved.
Yeah, they didn't announce those, but I would assume so as well. This looks like it's every single branch that can be involved is involved. Even like I said, even the Coast Guard. So.
All right. Similar vein. If China does blockade Taiwan, how will that affect the U.S. economically, since so much money is going into the AI data center buildouts? Okay. Well, who's it? Is it Fishback? James Fishback, one of the guys that's running for governor in the state of Florida. Okay, yeah. Robert's shaking his head. Yeah. Yes. Okay. He said on Twitter this morning, or X this morning, that he did not care about Taiwan. James, you have to care about Taiwan. 90% of the world's semiconductors currently are made in Taiwan. If we lose access to Taiwan, we cannot make those same volume, or like 2-3 nanometer. I mean, we're talking about tiny semiconductors that we need 2 nanometer. Yeah, I don't think we can make those domestically yet, right?
No, the smallest one I remember seeing is 4, and Taiwan. That's through the TSMC foundry in Arizona, and TSMC is, by Taiwanese law, forbidden from having the most advanced ones produced elsewhere.
Okay. All right. So how will this affect the U.S. economically? Well, it depends who you ask. But there's a guy named Ken Griffin, and he runs a hedge fund called Citadel Securities. And he said the United States would be looking at a 5 to 10% drop in GDP if we lost access to TSMC, if we lost access to Taiwan. I don't know enough about this to say that he's wrong. And I look at that. He's obviously got some inside information as a hedge fund guy. And let's just take that as our baseline. We lose 5% basically overnight or the next couple of weeks. We lose 5% of our US GDP, maybe 10%. That's a depression effectively. So this would be a massive development. And so I think I can't tell you exactly how all aspects of the US economy would fare, but technologically, it seems to me it'd be pretty devastating, like catastrophic for the U.S. tech development. Jared, is that your read?
It is, and I think that's just the immediate effect. You cannot the reason nobody can go, okay, Taiwan's not important, ignore it, is that is China's stepping stone to actually replacing the United States as world hegemon. If they break out of there, they can launch and get wherever they want to go, and they do want to go much further. They have made no bones about it. Japan needs payback. The Philippines is standing in their way. They want every sphere of influence. There were 8 of us, because America is one of them, must be crushed for China's rejuvenation, and Taiwan is standing in the way of that. That's why Taiwan is important.
That's revenge for their century of humiliation.
Yes, that is a requirement for China's rejuvenation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So I hope that answered your question. In short, not good. Not real good for the United States. And if you consider that GDP up, and all these banks are talking about, economic reacceleration. Remember, most of that economic acceleration is due to tech. It's due to AI. Most of the benefits and the gains from GDP up is going into tech, and it's going into Wall Street. It's not going into Main Street. So if that is the primary driver of economic growth, AI, basically the CapEx, the build outs, all this money that's being made and spent for AI and invested, if that's the only reason why GDP is going up, all of a sudden we lose that, then GDP goes down, and it would be very, very bad in technical terms. All right, regarding accelerating advances in quantum computing, Robert, Jared, I'm not an expert in this. If you have an idea, hop on. What do you see as the biggest impacts or disruptions it will have on the average person in the next decade? Well, I guess quantum proofing encryption. That's breaking encryption, like bank accounts, crypto, etc. I mean, I think threats to privacy has to be near the top. Correct, Robert?
Yeah. We already saw some of that disruption from the advances in generative AI and LLMs, large language models. That's already happened with that, where there are people with fake ransom calls, gaining access to information that they can then use for identity theft. I expect that would be probably the biggest disruption. The biggest impact overall will just be for most people, average people, will just be getting access to faster computers to watch Netflix, honestly, and then identity theft and those types of stuff we've already seen with AI.
Mm-hmm. Okay. By the way, let me just point something out here. There's a conversation about whether the conflict in this country is left versus right. And guess what? You can have conflict along an X and a Y axis. So it is left, right. It is also, you could say, globalist versus nationalist. You could say it is elite or the technocrats versus the populists, or it's the socialists versus the capitalists. So we're looking at many areas, rural versus urban. It's also, I look at Matt Braxton's Civil War III cube. It's like darker skin versus whiter skin, rural versus urban. What was the other one? There's some other axis there. It's a cube. So conflict can be among multiple axes. And by the way, there was a thing about, you can't, I hear this from time to time. I just say, I think the United States is headed towards worsening conflict. I'm talking about armed conflict, organized political violence. Okay. Coordinated political violence. I think we are headed there. And sometimes I'll have someone say, Mike, Democrats and Republicans, left and right, can't go to war. You can't tell these people apart. Well, first of all, that's not true. But second of all, there are these things called voter rolls, and there's voter information out there, and they're well-known politicians. And I don't say that to mean to be spicy. I'm just being realistic. And you look at like the Irish Troubles in Northern Ireland, and they would literally just ask each other, "What school did you go? Did you go to a Catholic or Protestant high school?" And that's it. And that's the distinction between friend and foe. In Yugoslavia, the Croats and the Bosnians and the Albanians and all those other people over there, they would literally just ask each other, "Hey, are you Croat or are you Bosnian? Are you Albanian?" And give them the wrong answer. And there you go. So, I mean, they literally just asked each other, "Hey, are you a friend or a foe?" So I'm just saying, no one needs a neon sign. No one needs to walk around with a Democrat or a Republican or a socialist or a capitalist hat on for there to be political violence. Frankly, a lot of the political violence in these types of low intensity conflicts, they're not even necessarily ideological or sectarian. Old scores get settled, like we saw that in Iraq and Afghanistan. We saw that in lots of other insurgencies and conflicts around the world. You really dislike this guy, and there's violence going all around you, and it's literally just civilian. It's warfare against civilians. There's a book. Maybe we'll talk about this book too. It's called "The Logic of Targeting Civilians in Civil Wars," or it's something. The book is something like that. Maybe we should reprise that book as well. All right, a couple other questions here we'll get through. If we are in a K-shaped economy, when will the bubble pop? What will happen to 90% of Americans on the low part of the K, and is there a way to grow the low half of the K? Well, I'm not an economist, but I can tell you, here's what we do for economic, financial, monetary stuff. I don't know. If I knew, I'd be working at Goldman Sachs making $1 trillion a year. But what I can do is look at what these big banks are saying and look at what hedge funds are saying. By the way, I messaged Michael Every. We're going to have a round 2 of a discussion on what the future of the dollar looks like, especially in light of this latest national security strategy, which I think paints a very good picture of what the future of the American empire looks like. So all I can do is provide you perspective. And what these big banks are telling their clients right now is that the bubble is not about to go pop. That's just what they're saying. They're saying Merrill, and again, this is just one source, one report, but Merrill, the CIO, the chief investment officer, or the chief investment office, a couple of weeks ago, said they think we are still early to mid-cycle in this AI boom. BlackRock said we're like mid-cycle. They see this AI boom still potentially continuing for years. This is on the assumption that Taiwan continues to export semiconductors. So all this is to say, we've seen these, especially on YouTube and social media. We've just seen these like constant predictions. Oh, the world's ending. The market is in a bubble. That bubble guy has been calling for a bubble burst for the past 10 years. He'll eventually be right, but he just has not been right yet. But at any rate, these big banks are saying this still could continue for years. So I don't, maybe we are close. Like you look at silver and gold and you say, maybe something's actually breaking or about to break. I don't know. But every Friday, I'll at least tell you what the big banks are saying. If you're an early warning member, head over to forwardobserver.com/trial. Sign up. You can start getting those reports. All right, regarding representatives, with the increase we've had in population and representatives apportioned to the population, how long will it be until the House has physically grown beyond its current limits? Well, I don't think we've had a net increase of representatives in the House, Robert, in a long time, maybe ever. I don't see the House growing. I don't think there's much talk. Maybe that will be a part of Project 2029. Maybe they add the number of senators or try to add members of the House. But the only thing that's grown is the population to representative ratio.
Yeah, so the 1929 Permanent Apportionment Act set the House at 435 members. So that's why there's this fight over the apportionment, over who can get more seats, and that's why it moves from state to state. Some lose and some gain. However, the Project 2029 thing I have seen for years now, a push for repealing the Permanent Apportionment Act and growing the size of the House, with obviously the idea that the proportion for Democrat to Republican will shift dramatically in the Democrats' favor. And in that case, if they did continue that same formula, I think it's like projections of like almost 2,000 representatives by the U.S. population post 2020. That would very quickly effectively make Congress even more ineffectual. It would be effectively at even more of a deadlock than it already is.
Mm-hmm. All right, so 1929. So we have not had an increase in representatives since 29. Maybe that changes with Project 2029, or what is it? Yeah, 2029. All right, last question for today. We'll save all other questions for tomorrow's show. Regarding this Chinese military exercise, they don't have any battle experience except in cyber. How well trained do you expect they are in reality? Jared, I remember this was probably 10 to 15 years ago, but I remember reading an article in the Wall Street Journal about China running these large-scale military exercises and having massive problems in command and control. They could not get subordinate units to do what they needed to do or what they wanted them to do. And there was just like a total breakdown. Now that was 10 to 15 years ago. How much of those problems do you think has been solved?
This is one of the critical factors that I've been bringing up about why I don't think 27 is likely. It's frankly, they're not ready. They are not qualitatively ready. All of their, I haven't seen reports on this year. There's unclassified reports released every year about how independent their exercises have been. But as recently as last year, even the joint ones with Russia, which Russia is very good at running independent exercises, were scripted. They were just not there. I think they will perform very poorly.
Mm-hmm. All right. So in the U.S. military runs scripted exercises as well. And the reason they do that is for practice. They basically say, like, let's go through this rehearsal and let's see what this looks like under scripted conditions. The problem is, and Jared, I know you know this, the problem is under scripted conditions do not account for friction. So there's a lot of increased friction. There's a lot of problems that you experience in war, internal and external. So internal friction means like loss of communications. You can't communicate. Units show up late, or they are not where they're supposed to be, or they don't do what they're supposed to. That's internal friction. We go back to Clausewitz on this. There's external friction. It rains. There's typhoons. There's storms. There's inclement weather. There's all sorts. There's the enemy can impose on you certain conditions that you did not foresee or did not believe would happen. That's external friction, and there's just a lot of friction in warfare that scripted exercises you don't experience during these scripted exercises. So a lot of this stuff, and it also does not account for commander ingenuity, commanders thinking outside the box and doing things that are least expected and result in potentially decisive victories in these conflicts. So all that is to say, Jared, you still don't think they're ready yet, correct? That's your bottom line.
Nope.
Okay.
Do not.
All right. Well, everyone, thanks so much for your support, Jared, Robert, as always. And thank you everyone for your questions and for your attention this morning. Listen, our mission here is to write the best 5-minute intelligence report that's available anywhere without a top secret security clearance. We're read by, I know we're read in the Army Special Operations community, Space Force. These reports wind up on JWICS, which is the military top secret network. Obviously, they're imported over. We're read by Moody's, by Lowe's, just by tons of large companies. And then we write that report in the morning. So you can read it in about 5 minutes long. Then we discuss it. And typically it takes, 30, 45 minutes, 60 minutes on the show. We discuss it. But that's our mission here every day, Monday through Friday, except for major holidays. And we would love it if you would join and support our mission. Here pretty soon, I got to check with Rob, our CTO, but we'll be deploying the next major update to our website. It is an open source intelligence platform. We'll have breaking news. We'll have our intelligence analysis, and then we'll have peer-to-peer connections. So you can talk about what's going on in Georgia or what's going on in Arizona, and you can share open source information on this platform. And this really is an effort to make information as flat as possible. We don't want to stovepipe information. I don't want Jared or Robert or myself or Archer or Cal Cal may be coming on board. I don't want any of us to be an impediment to you receiving information. So we're trying to make sure that we don't stovepipe information. We get that vital information out of the stovepipe. We make it as flat and open as possible. And that's why we're really trying to build this kind of crowdsourced peer-to-peer information sharing network. So with that, forwardobserver.com/trial. You can start receiving our report every morning, and then also ad-free videos behind the paywall as well. I'm really excited about this next big update. No one is doing, there's a lot of people doing something similar. There's a lot of newsletters and a lot of, I call them copycats. I've been at this for 10 years. Forward Observer is about to be 10 years old as we've been doing this. But there's nothing that is built out there. And I've been on a bunch of them. I've been on a bunch of these Intel apps and all these things. No one is doing what we're doing, and I'm really excited about that. So forwardobserver.com, that's our website. We appreciate your support. Everyone, that's going to do it for today. We will be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.